107.8 FM.
Hello and welcome to Sundazed. Now this week we have the second part of our two-part Dickens special. Some of the kids from Hetherset High have been looking at the work of Charles Dickens, particularly Great Expectations. And this week we're going to have the chapter where Pip, the main character in this story, goes to meet Miss Havisham. Now you may or may not be familiar with this character, but she's quite a fascination. Having been jilted at the altar 12 years previously, she now lives in a house with the wedding feast still on the table and her wedding dress that she's still wearing all in tatters. And she lives with an adopted daughter called Estella. Estella isn't the most delightful child, it has to be said, and Pip is left feeling quite humiliated by the time he's finished going for what you might very loosely describe as a playdate with Estella. First of all, we're going to hear from Ollie and Liam, who wanted to talk a little bit about different aspects of the book. This is Ollie, and Ollie wants to talk about the characters from Great Expectations.
In the book, my favourite character is probably Pip. I mean, it's an obvious choice, but it's probably because he changes so much in it. Yeah. Because when he starts, it's like the innocent child, and then he goes to Miss Havisham's house, and he sort of gets the idea of becoming a gentleman. Yeah. And then when he does become the gentleman, he changes a lot into being a snob and
is that a lot of that Miss Havisham's kind of manipulation?
Yeah, sort
of him, do you think?
Yeah, I think if he had never gone to her house, he wouldn't have wanted to become a gentleman.
No, so she puts lots of ideas in his his head.
It's like she's getting what she wants from him, and she's like planning out his life for him, even though she hasn't done much, but she's just...
It's a little bit like having a puppet on a string, isn't it?
She's planting this idea in his head.
Why does she want him to improve himself in the way that he does?
I think she's sort of planning for him to get with Estella, right? So that the same thing can happen to him and her that's happened to her. Yeah. So she like wants other people to suffer with her. So it's sort of kind of cruel.
That's very vindictive, isn't it? That's a very mean thing to do. To try and pass your misery on to somebody else like that. How unkind. Yeah. So who else is there was there anybody in the book who you didn't think was well drawn, or who you didn't draw to particularly? Or
his sister wasn't a very nice character.
Is she quite a bit older than him?
You don't find out her age, I think. I don't know what.
But she's a meanie, she beats him.
I think she went ill, so so her character went like straight away, so you don't really find out much
she
about
dies?
that. I think so. Yeah. So
quite convenient.
So she's there for like a little bit of the book, and then you don't find out much about her at all. So
what do you think of the name of the main character? Could you imagine a more suitable name for him?
If you're a gentleman in Victorian times, you'd think they have more of a posh name instead of just a nickname like Pip. So.
On the other hand, that's true, because he moves, I guess by the time he's gone from one end of the book to the other, he's kind of moved into somewhere else, and Pip doesn't any longer seem like a suitable name. But what's he done through the book? What would a Pip do? You put a Pip in the ground.
Yeah. So
water it, do all the right things to it.
Yeah, it grows into
grows and develops through the book. Yeah. And of course he's quite small. Yeah. Isn't he? Yeah. And so I don't know, you almost wonder whether or not his name is the thing that draws attention to itself more towards the end of the book, because it doesn't seem to suit him anymore. It's like he's outgrown himself. Yeah, but in some way.
The benefactor says that he should keep his name. So
right.
So it's like I don't know why that is. Find out about that maybe.
So you've yet to discover that, because you've not quite finished the book, all of you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Ollie.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
Now, one of the things that you wanted to talk about today, Liam, was the importance of studying Dickens in school. What are your conclusions about that then? Why is he still important?
Well, I think it's important to read anyway, because reading, I mean, obviously, as well as having vocabulary, it can also encourage a sense of imagination, which is becoming sort of increasingly important in jobs now, such as architectural design. But his stories are set in Victorian times, and they deal with problems back then that are still relevant now, because there are still a lot of, I mean, the sort of With Great Expectations, the way that they describe the class system, that could still be relevant today. And how certain, maybe not necessarily classes, but say certain people from certain nationalities or from certain religions maybe get preference for things such as jobs, whereas someone from another nationality maybe not. For example, even something as trivial as being stopped at an airport. People with a lot of money may be less likely to be stopped than others.
It's still not a fair world, is it, in all sorts of ways, and I don't suppose it ever will be. And you think that many of the problems that Dickens was writing about and facing are still very much in evidence today. What do you think about the way he addresses those problems and the way the action in the book goes, what happens to the heroes and the heroines? Is there a sense of justice playing out in the books? Do people get their just desserts? Or?
I think so. I feel that something Dickens does quite well is he managed to address a problem without directly referring to it. And that he talks about the way that Pip gave, for example, with Great Expectations again, he'll talk about the way that Pip will come into money, but he won't ever directly address that he's moved up in the world or that he's changed classes. And I feel that a good author is able to address a certain issue without directly talking about that certain issue, so that the reader is understanding about the issue kind of subliminally.
I think that's a really, really valid point, because it would be very boring if it read like some kind of social treaty or a history of the Victorian ones. I mean, he was writing in his own time, but you could still look back at it and think that it was all very yawny because it was, set in the olden days. But he manages to make you care about the characters and what happens to them. So, of course, you automatically consider their plight very carefully, you connect with them, you worry for them if things aren't going well, or you feel elated for them if things are going well, and so on. And it's the characters that drive the action. They take you through it. And that makes a huge difference.
I feel like Oliver Twist is a really good example of that, because straight away from when he's kicked out of is it a workhouse or an orphanage?
Yes,
As soon as he's kicked out, he instantly sort of feels sorry for him, and he manages to sustain that sorrow throughout the book, even when Pip's stealing and doing things which are seen to be wrong in the eyes of the world. We still feel sympathetic, and we're still willing him to sort of turn back around and become good again, instead of thinking, oh, I don't like this character anymore, I've stopped caring about him.
He's got some essential grain of goodness there, and you know that it's there, and you are fixed on that at his centre, and willing him to survive all of these trials and tribulations that have happened to him. Well, this is very interesting, Liam. I'm glad that you've been enjoying it. Right, now we've got Alicia and Caroline with us now. You wanted to talk about Dickens' writing techniques.
Yeah.
What do you think about his technique?
I think him himself was quite inspirational, and I thought that when people were talking about him so much, he was quite overrated. But he's not, because he does write very fluently. It's not all predictable and blocky, and like there's not just a straightforward description. He just blends it all in and just makes it like you're almost there.
That's very important, isn't it? If somebody can draw you into the book and make you see the same things that they're seeing, the pictures in their head. Do you feel as well, when he's describing things, that even if he's not necessarily talking, for instance, about the smell that's around him at the time, or the sounds, you still get a sense of where the characters are standing and what it smells like and what the sounds are, just from the sort of general description that he gives?
He doesn't have to describe it just solidly like that. He sort of interprets it through Pip's senses and his reactions, so you don't have to so you end up assuming and imagining where he is, not just there was a big lingering smell, it's more my nostrils like that's the reaction.
It's very textured writing. And although it is quite dense the way it's written, you said before, didn't you, that you didn't feel that tripped you up? You felt like it was fluent and easy to read.
You think that because it's from ages ago, it'll be quite ancient and flowery and full of similes and complex sentences, but it just shows what skill he has, and it never really changes in time. You learn it, and then it depends how you grow from there to do the writing. And Dickens was very skillful, and he did grow to be a good writer.
Yes,
that's why he's still around.
Yeah,
books are still so well loved because they're not old-fashioned. They're actually the way the writing style still exists nowadays.
Yes.
So it's sort of not from it. If they wouldn't know about Charles Dickens, they probably would have thought it was quite a newish book because of the way it's written. And
so you think the way, I mean, his descriptions of his characters, for instance, it gives them a kind of eternal sense because you can still see those kind of people around. The way in which he unfolds the plot, what do you think to that? Is it quite fast-moving, quite fast-paced? Certainly from what Ben was reading, because Ben read chapter 1, and almost from the beginning, there he is standing there looking at these graves and all quiet and contemplative, and the next thing you know, he's being shaken upside down, so all the money and the bread, and well, no money, he hasn't got any money, but the bread falls out of his pockets and all this kind of thing. So, whoa, hang on a minute, I've not even had time to draw breath, and some things going on.
I think especially for younger children that's good. There's no time wasting. Like I said, there's not just words just to fill up a page. It's almost like the writing you're reading it in the time of Pip, so none of it's slowed down to get extra description in. He's just describing it fluently like you were there, just stages happening, not just longer than what it would actually be.
Yes. Is there anything else in particular about his technique? Anything that you've discovered in class?
he uses the weather and like the setting to describe the feelings of people. So because the graveyard in the first chapter is very gloomy and very enclosed, it sort of gives the feeling of like Pip's vulnerability and how he can't really escape because it's so enclosed, and like it says about the fog coming around, and like you always think of fog being quite like thick and horrible, so
and you can't see who else might be lurking in the fog with
so
you.
It kind of shows how he feels without actually saying how he feels.
That's a very good technique, isn't it? And it's very true to life as well, because we are greatly affected by the weather. I mean, everybody is under the weather. You have to take whatever is there each day, and if it is foggy and gloomy, that affects your spirits. And yes, he could have had Pip skipping through the graveyard, through the daffodils on a bright and sunny day with lambs skittering about, but it just wouldn't have had the same.
Worked at all. It just wouldn't have worked.
No, it would have had a completely different feel to it, and wouldn't have given
effect. It wouldn't have had such a big effect that it did on.
Yes.
You would have felt so sympathetic and everything.
And of course, whatever the weather might be in reality, when you're writing a book, you can have whatever you like. You can pick the perfect weather for the perfect scene. And I think to understand that we are so greatly affected by external conditions and to use that to his advantage. What's the weather like in Miss Havisham's house?
That's the thing, you don't really know what the weather's like because all of the outdoors is blocked off. It's her house. It sort of creates a sort of like weather of its own. It's sort of it relates to the graveyard that's sort of in a house.
Yeah. But it's sort of there's a big contrast because outside it's all sort of sunny and it's all like happy and everything. Right. As soon as you go in, you're like the whole atmosphere and everything. So it does make, like Alicia said, makes the atmosphere like weather of its own. Yeah. And then when that's when like Pip goes back outside, he doesn't know what's happening, and it's sort of dazes him a bit because there's such a big contrast between
a sort of disorientation from coming out of a gloomy, very gloomy interior. And I always get, whether it says it explicitly or not, I always get the feeling with Miss Havisham's that the windows are probably very dusty, or the curtains are drawn, and she wants as little light coming in as
she doesn't want to know whether
possible.
It's night or dark. She doesn't want to know the time.
Yeah, because as you said earlier, she's sort of lost in time.
She stops the clocks just before her wedding. I think that she's so much in denial of her husband, the man walking out on her, that she just wants everything to stay in that era just in case she could try again and go back and mend it, but it's not going to happen. So she can't face it.
But she's a really fascinating character, isn't Miss Havisham?
She's really bizarre, but it's sort of you need it. It wouldn't be the same without Miss Havisham.
Oh no, absolutely not. Very interesting and a real sort of pivotal character in the book. Now, you wanted to read a passage, didn't you, about Miss Havisham's house from chapter 8.
Pip has just been asked to come to where Miss Havisham lives. He doesn't know why, but he gets all like, because it's such a big posh house and Pip's kind of very poor. So he gets all dressed up in his like best clothes and it's really a bit confused at why he's there. And then once he gets there,
it's quite significant because as well as Miss Havisham being in there, who's an interesting character, it's him and Estella, and that's quite binding. You just know that it's going to take somewhere.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
Call Estella, she repeated, flashing a look at me. You can do that. Call Estella, at the door, to stand in the dark in a mysterious passage of an unknown house, boarding Estella to a scornful young lady, neither visible nor responsive, and feeling it a dreadful liberty, so to roar out her name was almost as bad as playing to order. But she answered at last, and her light came along the dark passage like a star. Miss Havisham beckoned her to come close, and took up a jewel from the table, and tried its effect upon her fair young bosom, and against her pretty brown hair. Your own, one day, my dear, and you will use it well. Let me see you play cards with this boy. With this boy? Why, he's just a common labouring boy. I thought I overheard Miss Havisham answer, only it seemed unlikely. Well, you can break his heart. What do you play, boy? Asked Estella of myself with the greatest disdain. Nothing but beggar, my neighbour, miss.
Beggar him, said Miss Havisham to Estella, so we sat down at cards. It was then I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like the watch on the clock a long time ago. I noticed that Miss Havisham put down the jewellery exactly on the spot from which she had taken it up. As Estella dealt the cards, I glanced at the dressing table again, and saw that the shoe upon it, once white, now yellow, had never been worn. I glanced down at the foot from which the shoe was absent, and saw that the silk stocking on it, once yellow, now yellow, had been trodden ragged. Without this arrest of everything, this standing still of all the pale, decayed objects, nor even the withered bridal dress on the collapsed form could have looked so like grave clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. So she sat, corpse-like, as we played at cards. The frillings and trimmings on her bridal dress looking like earthy paper. I knew nothing then of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in the moment of being distinctly seen. But I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust.
He calls the knaves Jack, this boy, said Estella with disdain before our first game was out. And what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots! I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt was so strong that it had become infectious, and I caught it. She won the game, and I dealt. I misdealt, as it was only natural when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong, and she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy labouring boy. You say nothing of her, remarked Miss Havisham to me as she looked on. She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her? I don't like to say, I stammered. Tell me in my ear, said Miss Havisham, bending down. I think she is very proud, I replied in a whisper. Anything else? I think she is very pretty. Anything else? I think she is very insulting. She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. Anything else? I think I should like to go home.
And never see her again, though she is so pretty. I'm not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now. You shall go soon, said Miss Havisham aloud. Play the game out. Saving for the one weird smile at first, I should have felt almost sure that Miss Havisham's face could not smile. It had dropped into a watchful and brooding expression, most likely when all the things about her had become transfixed, and it looked as if nothing could ever lift it up again. Her chest had dropped, so that she stooped, and her voice had dropped, so that she spoke low, and with a dead lull upon her altogether, she had the appearance of having drooped body and soul within and without, under the weight of a crushing blow. I played the game to an end with Estella, and she begged me. She threw the cards down on the table when she had won them all, as if she despised them for having been won again. When shall I have you here again? Said Miss Havisham. Let me think. I was beginning to remind her that today was Wednesday, when she checked me with her former impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand. There, I know nothing of the days of the week. I know nothing of weeks of the year. Come again in 6 days. You hear? Yes, ma'am. Estella, take him down, let him have something to eat, and let him roam and look about him while he eats. Go, Pip.
I followed the candle down as I had followed the candle up, and she stood it in the place where we had found it, until she opened the side entrance. I had fancied, without thinking about it, that it must necessarily be night time. The rush of daylight quite confounded me, and made me feel as if I had been in candlelight of the strange room for many hours. You wait here, you boy, said Estella, and disappeared and closed the door. I took the opportunity of being alone in the courtyard to look at my coarse hands and my common boots. My opinion of those accessories was not favourable. They had never troubled me before, but they troubled me now, as vulgar appendages. I determined to ask Joe why he had ever taught me to call those picture cards jacks, which ought to be called knaves. I wish Joe had been rather more genteelly brought up, and then I should have been so too. She came back with some bread and meat and a little mug of beer. She put them down on the stones of the yard and gave me the bread and meat without looking at me, as insolently as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated, hurt, spurned, offended, angry, sorry. I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart. God knows what its name was. The tears started to my eyes. The moment they sprang there, the girl looked at me with a quick delight in having been the cause of them. This gave me power to keep them back and to look at her. So she gave me a contemptuous toss, but that with a sense I thought of having made too sure that I was so wounded, and left me.
But when she was gone, I looked about me for a place to hide my face in, and got behind one of the gates in the brewery lane, and leaned my sleeve against the wall there, and leaned my forehead on it, and cried.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
As I cried, I kicked the wall and took a hard twist at my hair. So bitter were my feelings, and so sharp was the smart without a name that needed counteraction. My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice, but the child is small, and its world is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high, according to scale, as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself I had sustained, from my babyhood, a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known from the time when I could speak that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all my punishments, disgraces, fasts, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it, in a solitary and unprotected way, I, in great part, refer to the fact that I was morally timid and very sensitive.
I got rid of all my injured feelings for the time by kicking them into the brewery wall and twisting them out of my hair, and then I smoothed my face with my sleeve and came from behind the gate. The bread and meat were acceptable, and the beer was warming and tingling, and I was soon in spirits to look about me. To be sure, it was a deserted place, down to the pigeon house in the brewery yard, which had been blown crooked on its pole by some high wind, and would have made the pigeons think themselves at sea, if there had been any pigeons there to be rocked by it. But there were no pigeons in the dovecot, no horses in the stables, no pigs in the sty, no malt in the storehorse, no smells or grains and beer in the copper or the vat. All the uses and scents of the brewery might have evaporated with its last reek of smoke. In a barnyard there was a wilderness of empty casks, which had a certain sour remembrance of better days lingering about them, but it was too sour to be accepted as a sample of the beer that was gone, and in the respect I remembered those recluses as being like most others. Behind the furthest end of the brewery was a rank garden with an old wall, not so high but that I could struggle up and hold on long enough to look over it, and see that the rank garden was the garden of the house, and that it was overgrown with tangled weeds, but that there was a track upon the green and yellow paths, as if someone sometimes walked there, and that Estella was walking away from me even then, but She seemed to be everywhere, for when I yielded to the temptation presented by the casks and began to walk on them, I saw her walking on them at the end of the yard of casks. She had her back towards me and held her pretty brown hair spread out in her 2 hands, and never looked round, and passed out of my view directly. So, in the brewery itself, by which I mean the large paved lofty place in which they used to make the beer, and where the brewing utensils still were, when I first went into it, and, rather oppressed by its gloom, stood near the door looking about me, I saw her pass among the extinguished fires, and ascend some light iron stairs, and go out by a gallery high overhead, as if she were going out into the sky.
It was in this place, and at this moment, that a strange thing happened to my fancy. I thought it a strange thing then, and I thought it a stranger thing long afterwards. I turned my eyes, a little dimmed by looking up at the frosty light, towards a great wooden beam in a low nook of the building near me on my right hand, and I saw a figure hanging there by the neck, a figure all in yellow-white, with but one shoe to the feet, and it hung so that I could see the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthy paper, and that the face was Miss Havisham's, with a movement going over the whole countenance, as if she were trying to call to me. In terror of seeing the figure, and in the terror of being certain that it had not been there a moment before, I at first ran from it, and then ran towards it, and my terror was greatest of all when I found no figure there. Nothing less than the frosty light of the cheerful sky, the sight of people passing beyond the bars of the courtyard gate, and the reviving influence of the rest of the bread and meat and beer would have brought me round. Even with those aids, I might not have come to myself as soon as I did, but that I saw Estella approaching with the keys to let me out. She would have some fair reason for looking down upon me, I thought, if she saw me frightened, and she would have no fair reason.
She gave me a triumphant glance in passing me, as if she enjoyed that my hands were so coarse and my boots were so thick, and she opened the gate and stood holding it. I was passing out without looking at her, and she touched me with a taunting hand. "Why don't you cry?" "Because I don't want to." "You do," she said. "You have been crying till you are half blind, and you are near crying against now." She laughed contemptuously, pushed me out, and locked the gate upon me. I went straight to Mr. Pumblechook's, and was immensely relieved to find him not at home. So, leaving word with the shopman on what day I was wanted at Miss Havisham's again, I set off on the 4-mile walk to our forge, pondering, as I went along, on all I had seen, and deeply revolving that I was a common labouring boy, that my hands were coarse, my boots were thick, that I had fallen into a despicable habit of calling knaves jacks, that I was much more ignorant than I had considered myself last night, and genuinely that I was in a low-lived bad way.
That was absolutely fantastic. Well, it's been a real pleasure, girls, to listen, and to being read to is always a great pleasure, and you've done so well there. And I think that to be able to get a sense of how people are responding to Dickens today has been a very interesting experience. So thank you very much indeed.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.